In the winter of 1386, a crowd gathered outside a Parisian monastery to watch two men try to kill each other. This was not an execution. It was not a war. It was the law. At least it was what medieval France called justice when every other option had failed. One man was a knight who believed his wife had been wronged. The other was a squire who swore, to his very last breath, that he was innocent. And King Charles VI himself sat in the stands to watch, because the outcome of this fight would decide, in the eyes of God and France, who was telling the truth. This is the story of the last legally sanctioned judicial duel in French history, and the woman whose testimony set it all in motion. Our story begins in Normandy, in the household of a nobleman named Jean de Carrouges. He was a knight of modest fortune, descended from a respected but fading family line, proud of his lineage, and hungry for recognition he felt he had never quite earned. He had served in wars against the English in Scotland and beyond. He had petitioned for royal favor more than once, and time and again, he watched other men rise faster than he did, collecting titles and land while his own fortunes stagnated. Bitterness, slow and quiet, began to settle into him. One of the men who seemed to rise effortlessly was a squire named Jacques Le Gris. Le Gris was clever, charming, well-spoken in court circles, and deeply favored by his lord, the powerful Count Pierre d'Alençon. For years, Carrouges and Le Gris were something like friends, or at least close enough that Carrouges once asked Le Gris to stand as godfather to his infant son. They had fought alongside one another. They had shared tables, wine, and confidences. That friendship curdled into rivalry. Carrouges believed Le Gris was being handed lands and honors that should rightfully have gone to him, particularly a valuable estate that Carrouges felt was owed to his family. Lawsuits followed. Petitions to the Count went unanswered or were quietly dismissed in favor of Le Gris. Grudges deepened year after year, simmering beneath the surface of courtly politeness. Then, in January of 1386, everything changed. Carrouges had remarried a young noblewoman named Marguerite de Thibouville, the daughter of a once wealthy family whose fortunes had been damaged by accusations of treason against her own father years earlier. She was intelligent, well-regarded, and by every surviving account, devoted to restoring her family's tarnished name through her marriage. While Carrouges was away in Paris attending to business and legal matters, Marguerite was left largely alone at the family estate, with only a handful of servants for company. And according to her testimony, given later before the highest court in France, Jacques Le Gris forced his way into the household that day and assaulted her. When Carrouges returned home, Marguerite told him what had happened in detail without wavering. He believed her without hesitation. But belief was not enough. Under French law at the time, a woman's accusation against a powerful, favored man carried enormous risk, and not just for the accused. If a court ruled against her, if her word was judged false, she herself could face brutal punishment for the crime of false accusation. Still, Carrouges pursued it. He took the case first to a local court in Normandy, where Le Gris's connections made a fair hearing nearly impossible. When that avenue closed, he escalated the case all the way to the Parliament of Paris, the highest judicial body in the kingdom, risking his own reputation, his finances, and his standing with powerful men to do it. The Parliament deliberated for months. Witnesses were summoned and questioned at length. Alibis were presented and cross-examined. Le Gris claimed he had been many miles away on the day in question, and several men, some of them owing their positions to his patron, came forward to vouch for his whereabouts. The case became a tangled, contradictory mess of testimony, aristocratic influence, and unresolved doubt, the kind of stalemate medieval courts sometimes simply could not untangle through evidence and argument alone. So the Parliament did something France had not formally sanctioned in decades. They ordered a trial by combat, a judicial duel fought to the death, resting on the old belief that God himself would not allow a guilty man to walk away from the field alive. For Marguerite, this was a horrifying gamble. Trial by combat placed the entire truth of her accusation on her husband's sword arm, on his strength, his skill, his luck on a single winter morning. If Carrouges lost, his death would be taken as divine proof that she had lied, and she would be burned at the stake immediately afterward. Her fate, her very life, depended entirely on a fight she was forbidden to take part in herself. The date was set, the location, the grounds of the monastery of Saint Martin des Champs, just outside the walls of Paris, a space normally reserved for prayer now converted into a fenced arena of packed earth and timber stands. The date, the 29th of December, 1386. King Charles VI, only 17 years old at the time, postponed other royal business specifically to attend in person. Nobles arrived in fine cloaks despite the winter cold. Clergy came to bear witness to what many considered a sacred judgment, and commoners packed in wherever they could find room, drawn by the rare spectacle of a fight to the death sanctioned by the crown itself. Marguerite was brought to the field as well, dressed head to toe in black mourning clothes, and seated in a place where she would be forced to watch every moment, and where, if her husband fell, she would be dragged away toward her own execution without delay. The two men entered the lists in full plate armor, each accompanied by his own priest, so that both might make a final confession before God, regardless of which side justice truly favored. Jean de Carrouges was older, weathered by years of open warfare, while Jacques Le Gris was younger and known throughout the court for his considerable physical strength. Before the fight began, Carrouges reportedly turned to his wife one last time and told her that if he lived, it would be because her cause was just, and that if he died, she should know he never doubted her. Then the combat began. Accounts from chroniclers of the time describe a brutal, close, and desperate fight, first on horseback with lances, the two men colliding at speed across the packed earth, and then on foot with swords and daggers once both were unhorsed and their lances shattered. Blood was drawn early. Carrouges took a wound to the thigh that darkened his hose and left a slick trail across the frozen ground. For several long, terrible minutes, it seemed the fight could go either way, and the crowd, the king included, watched in near total silence, the only sound the ring of steel and the labored breathing of two exhausted men. But Carrouges pressed forward, driving through pain, driving through fatigue, until he finally forced Le Gris down onto the churned earth. In the final, desperate exchange, dagger drawn, Carrouges demanded that Le Gris confess to the crime before he would show him any mercy. Le Gris, pinned and bleeding, continued to deny it, insisting with his last breaths that he was innocent, that God knew the truth even if the sword did not. Carrouges killed him where he lay. The crowd erupted. To the thousands watching, this was not merely the end of a duel, it was a verdict handed down from God himself. Carrouges had won, and by the unforgiving logic of trial by combat, that meant Marguerite had told the truth. King Charles granted Carrouges a substantial reward on the spot, along with lands that had once been contested between him and the man he had just killed. Marguerite was publicly vindicated in front of the entire court. The stake that had been prepared for her, waiting at the edge of the field, was never lit. Jean de Carrouges went on to fight in later campaigns, including a crusade against Ottoman forces, and died years afterward on foreign soil, remembered, at least for a time, as a knight whose honor had been proven in the most extreme way medieval law allowed. But history rarely settles as cleanly as a duel implies. Trial by combat assumed that God would intervene directly to protect the righteous, and that physical victory was proof of moral truth. It was not. It was proof of who was the better fighter that particular morning, wearing the better armor, with the better luck and the deeper reserve of strength. Modern historians still debate what truly happened between Marguerite and Jacques Le Gris, since the surviving records come almost entirely from chroniclers' writing years, sometimes decades later, shaped by the politics, biases, and assumptions of their own time, rather than by the two people who were actually there. What we do know with certainty is this. In an age when a woman's word alone meant almost nothing in a court of law, Marguerite de Thibouville staked her own life on being believed, and in doing so, forced an entire kingdom to stop, watch, and decide. Not long after this case, France quietly began moving away from trial by combat altogether, favoring investigation and testimony over the sword. This duel is remembered today, in part, precisely because it was one of the very last of its kind, a moment where a medieval kingdom still let steel and blood answer a question that law and testimony alone could not settle. Whether it was justice, chance, or something caught in between the two, the field outside that Paris monastery held its answer for over 600 years. And in many ways, it is still being argued about today.